Chattanooga, Tennessee, June 12, 2023. Leona Daley, a 38-year-old beloved community volunteer, was found dead in her home. The house showed signs of a break-in, but nothing of real value was missing. At first glance, the case appeared to be a random incident, but as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a far more sinister motive. To understand how this suburban home became the epicenter of such devastation, we need to go back to the small cracks that began to form in the Daley's marriage, a story of love, lies, and betrayal in the heart of Chattanooga. Chattanooga, Tennessee, a city framed by the Appalachian Mountains and cradled by the Tennessee River. Leona and Graham Daley were the kind of couple others admired. They had built a life that seemed sturdy and unshakable, a reflection of their love and commitment. At least, that's what people thought. Leona was the sort of woman who could light up a room just by walking in. At 38, she had a natural warmth that made everyone feel like they mattered. She was deeply involved in the community, volunteering at local charities, organizing fundraisers, and never missing an opportunity to lend a hand. Her laugh was infectious, her kindness genuine, and everyone from neighbors to churchgoers had a story about how Leona had touched their lives. Graham, on the other hand, was quieter, a steady presence in Leona's orbit. At 42, he worked long hours as an HVAC technician, the kind of job that didn't earn much attention but kept the bills paid and their modest home comfortable. He adored Leona, or at least the version of her he thought he knew. Together, they seemed the perfect match, grounded, loving, and rooted in the traditions of their small southern town. But even in the closest relationships, cracks can form. Graham had started to notice the changes gradually, like the way the evening light shifts as summer turns to fall. Leona's schedule had always been packed, but lately, she seemed busier than ever. She began coming home later, claiming long meetings or extra time needed for planning her charity events. She laughed it off when Graham teased her about always being on the go, but he couldn't help feeling that something was off. One night, as they sat on their back porch listening to the hum of cicadas, Graham tried to voice his concerns. "You've been running yourself ragged," he said, glancing at her over his beer. "Maybe we should take a weekend off. Just us." Leona gave him a soft smile, the kind she always used when she wanted to reassure him without really saying anything. "I'd love that," she replied, her voice carrying the sincerity he desperately wanted to believe. "But I just can't right now. There's so much to do." Graham nodded, letting the moment pass, but a quiet unease settled over him. For the first time in years, he felt like there was a part of Leona he couldn't reach. It wasn't just her schedule. Leona had started locking her phone, a new habit that caught Graham's attention. She'd always been open with him, even teasing him about her lack of privacy because she had nothing to hide. But now, her phone was glued to her hand, the screen going dark whenever he glanced her way. When he asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying it was to keep her work stuff organized. Then there were the late-night outings. Leona had begun slipping out after dinner, saying she needed to run errands or meet with someone from the charity. Graham told himself not to read too much into it. Leona had always been fiercely independent, and she was constantly juggling responsibilities. But still, the timing felt strange, and her explanations were vague. One Friday evening, as Leona prepared to leave again, Graham tried to mask his frustration. "Another meeting?" he asked, forcing a casual tone. She nodded while grabbing her bag. "Just something quick. Don't wait up." He watched her go, the sound of her car fading into the night, leaving the house unnervingly quiet. Graham stared at the clock, his thoughts churning. Leona had always been so honest, so transparent. But now, for the first time in their marriage, he felt like he was standing on the outside, looking in. That night, Graham lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He told himself it was nothing, that he was overthinking things. Leona had always been dedicated to her work and her community. Maybe she was just stretched thin, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. The next morning, he decided to follow his gut. While Leona was out running errands, Graham checked the kitchen counter where she often left receipts. Most were for mundane purchases, groceries, gas, coffee. But one stood out, a receipt from a trendy bar on the North Shore, a place Leona rarely went. It was dated 2 nights ago, the same evening she had told him she was volunteering late. Graham held the slip of paper in his hand, his mind racing. He wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but a part of him hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if this was all innocent, and he was just letting his insecurities get the better of him? But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Graham couldn't ignore it. That evening, when Leona came home, he casually brought up the bar. "Someone at work mentioned that new place on the North Shore," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "Ever been?" Leona froze for just a second, barely noticeable, but enough to confirm Graham's suspicions. Then she smiled. "I think I stopped there once with some friends." "Why?" "No reason," he said, forcing a smile. The conversation moved on, but Graham's heart felt heavy. He didn't press her further, but the ease with which she lied, if it was a lie, gnawed at him. He knew Leona better than anyone, or at least he thought he did. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was keeping something from him. Over the next few days, Graham's curiosity turned into an obsession. He began watching her more closely, paying attention to the way she spoke, the way she moved. Every smile, every excuse felt like another piece of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Graham didn't know it yet, but his quiet suspicion was about to ignite a chain of events that would unravel their seemingly perfect life. And when the truth finally came to light, it would leave devastation in its wake. The subtle distance between Graham and Leona grew like an invisible wall, inch by inch, until it was impossible for Graham to ignore. Every interaction felt scripted, every smile rehearsed. Leona was still the kind, warm woman everyone loved, but something in her demeanor had shifted, something she didn't want Graham to see. And that nagging feeling, the one that had started as a whisper in the back of his mind, was now a deafening roar. One evening, while Leona was in the shower, Graham's curiosity finally got the better of him. He reached for her phone, sitting on the nightstand. It was locked, of course, but Graham had always known her passcode, at least the old one. When his first attempt failed, his stomach tightened. She'd changed it. The realization hit harder than he expected. Leona had never hidden anything from him before, not like this. Why now? The next day, Graham decided to follow his gut. He drove to the bar on the North Shore, the one from the receipt, and parked across the street, watching the entrance. He didn't know what he was looking for, but something about being there made him feel closer to an answer. Hours passed without any sign of Leona, and just as Graham was about to give up, he saw someone step out of the bar that made his breath catch. Clint, his best friend. Clint was laughing, his arm draped casually around the shoulders of a woman Graham couldn't immediately identify. As they moved into the light, Graham's heart sank. It was Leona. They walked down the street together, their conversation animated. Clint leaned in close, and Leona didn't pull away. Graham felt his chest tighten as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. For a moment, he considered confronting them right there, but something held him back. He needed to know more. Later that night, Graham tried to act normal as Leona came home. She greeted him with a peck on the cheek and a warm smile that made him question everything he'd seen. Could he have misinterpreted it? "Busy day?" he asked casually, watching her every move. "Exhausting," she replied with a sigh, slipping off her shoes. "I had to meet a few people from the charity group. You know how it is." He nodded, biting his tongue. In the days that followed, Graham began piecing together a clearer picture of what was going on. He found more receipts, all pointing to places on the North Shore. He noticed how often Leona mentioned meetings and volunteer work that seemed to coincide with the times Clint was unavailable. One night, when Leona said she had another late meeting, Graham decided to follow her. He waited a few minutes after she left before grabbing his keys and heading out. He kept his distance, his truck blending into the sparse evening traffic as he tailed her across town. She pulled into the parking lot of a secluded motel just outside the city limits. Graham parked a safe distance away, his pulse racing as he watched her get out of the car. Clint was already there, leaning against the motel entrance. He greeted her with a quick embrace before they disappeared inside. Graham sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of what he just witnessed pressing down on him. Every happy memory he shared with Leona felt like a cruel joke. The woman he had loved, the life they had built together, it was all a lie. When Leona finally returned home that night, Graham said nothing. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as she slipped in beside him, smelling faintly of cheap motel soap. His mind churned with questions, but he knew confronting her now wouldn't give him the answers he needed. The following week, Graham started digging into Clint's life. Clint had always been a good friend, or so Graham thought. They'd known each other for years, and Graham had always trusted him implicitly. But now, that trust felt like a bad joke. Through a coworker, Graham learned that Clint had been struggling financially. He'd borrowed money from friends and gambled it away at underground poker games in Chattanooga's seedier neighborhoods. Clint's charm, the thing that had always made him so likable, was also his greatest weapon. He could talk his way into anything, and it seemed he had used that skill to exploit everyone around him, including Graham. Fueled by anger and heartbreak, Graham made the fateful decision to look through Leona's phone. This time, he waited until she was asleep, her breathing soft and even beside him. He carefully reached for her phone on the nightstand and slipped it into his hand. Graham had spent the past few days observing Leona's habits, and he'd noticed something. Each time she unlocked her phone, she swiped in the same pattern. After several failed attempts, he got it right. What he found confirmed his worst fears. There were messages between Leona and Clint, hundreds of them. In them, they mocked Graham, laughing about how easy it was to keep him in the dark. They talked about their plans, their future together. Clint joked about how Graham would never see it coming, while Leona assured him she was taking care of everything. Reading those words, Graham felt something inside him snap. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the cruelty. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, had not only betrayed him but had done so with malice. That night, as Leona slept soundly beside him, Graham lay awake, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the images of Leona and Clint together, the sound of their mocking laughter echoing in his head. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but every time he imagined her face, all he could see was her lies. The following morning, Graham called in sick to work. He spent the day driving aimlessly through the city, his thoughts a chaotic storm. By the time the sun began to set, he found himself parked near the motel where he had seen Leona and Clint. He didn't know why he was there, but something about the place drew him in, like a moth to a flame. As he sat in his truck, staring at the neon sign flickering in the distance, Graham made a decision. He couldn't keep living like this. He needed answers, and he was going to get them, no matter what it took. When Leona came home that night, Graham was waiting for her in the living room. His hands were trembling, but he steadied himself, determined not to let his emotions get the better of him. "Leona," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." She hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from him. "What's this about?" Graham stared at her, searching her face for any trace of the woman he had married. But all he saw was a stranger. "I know," he said simply. Her eyes widened, but she quickly masked her surprise. "Know what?" "About you and Clint," he said, his voice tightening with each word. "I know everything." For a moment, Leona looked like she might deny it. But then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a long sigh. "Graham, she began, but he cut her off. "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't try to explain it away. I saw the messages, Leona. I know you've been lying to me, and I need to know why." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, but Graham wasn't moved. He had spent too many sleepless nights imagining this moment, and now that it was here, he felt nothing but anger. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It just did." Graham stood, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You didn't mean to sneak around behind my back? You didn't mean to lie to my face every single day?" Leona looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Leona," he said, his voice breaking. "You destroyed everything we had. Everything." She tried to reach for him, but he stepped back, his jaw tightening. "Don't," he said. "Just don't." That night, Graham left the house and drove aimlessly, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on him. He didn't know what to do or where to go, but he knew one thing. His life would never be the same. The weight of Leona's cheating bore down on Graham as if it were a tangible force, suffocating him at every turn. Days passed in a haze, each one more unbearable than the last. He tried to distract himself by throwing himself into work, but his thoughts always circled back to the same questions. How long had it been going on? Why Clint? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what had he done to deserve this? Graham didn't know whether it was anger, heartbreak, or the sheer humiliation of being cheated on that fueled his obsession. But one thing was clear. He couldn't let it go. The more he thought about Clint and Leona, the more he needed answers, and not just from Leona. The betrayal from Clint, someone Graham had considered his closest friend, cut even deeper than Leona's deceit. Clint had been the guy Graham turned to for advice, for laughs, for camaraderie. Yet, he had been sneaking behind Graham's back with the one person Graham had trusted above all others. It wasn't just cheating. It was a complete destruction of the life Graham thought he had built. Determined to understand, Graham began digging deeper into Clint's life. Clint had always been charming, the kind of guy who could talk his way out of trouble or into an opportunity. That charm had made him popular, but Graham was beginning to see the cracks beneath it. Clint wasn't the golden boy everyone thought he was. Through mutual acquaintances, Graham learned that Clint had racked up significant gambling debts. Clint had borrowed money from friends, co-workers, and even strangers, spinning elaborate stories to explain why he needed it. Most of that money had been squandered at underground poker games run by a group of shady characters in Chattanooga's less reputable neighborhoods. Clint was in over his head, and his easygoing smile was the only thing keeping people from demanding their money back. The more Graham uncovered, the angrier he became. Clint hadn't just cheated with his wife. He'd used Graham's trust and friendship as a weapon. Graham couldn't stop replaying the moments in his head. The bar, the motel, the messages mocking him. It wasn't just about Leona anymore. It was about Clint's smug confidence, his belief that Graham would never figure it out. Fueled by a mix of rage and morbid curiosity, Graham continued to pry into Clint's life. He learned that Clint's financial problems weren't just personal. They had seeped into his professional relationships, too. Clint had borrowed money from co-workers at their HVAC company, promising quick repayments that never materialized. When the debts piled up, Clint switched tactics, charming his way into new opportunities and using people like stepping stones to keep his head above water. But there was more. Through a mutual friend, Graham discovered that Clint had once been involved in another affair with a married woman, one that had ended in a public scandal. Clint had a pattern. A reckless disregard for boundaries and a selfish need to satisfy his desires, no matter the cost. Graham couldn't believe he'd ever called this man his friend. Meanwhile, at home, Graham's relationship with Leona had devolved into icy silence. The confrontation from days earlier had left a permanent mark. She avoided him, retreating to her office or spending long hours away from the house. Graham knew she was trying to give him space, but to him, it felt like she was hiding, avoiding the reality of what they had become. Graham's anger festered. He spent his nights scrolling through Leona's messages with Clint, each word a fresh wound. In one exchange, Leona told Clint she was tired of living with Graham, describing their life together as predictable and stifling. Clint responded with reassurances, promising her a life of excitement and freedom. It wasn't just the content of the messages that enraged Graham. It was their tone. They weren't apologetic or hesitant. They were cruel, as if they both reveled in Graham's ignorance. It made Graham feel like a fool, and he hated them for it. But it was one particular message that pushed Graham over the edge. "I'll talk to him soon," Leona had written to Clint. "But he's so clueless, I doubt he'll ever figure it out on his own." Clint's response was a string of laughing emojis. Graham stared at the screen, his vision blurring with rage. This wasn't just about cheating. It was about humiliation. They had made him into a joke, and he couldn't stand it. From that moment on, Graham stopped caring about reconciliation or closure. He wanted justice. He wanted Clint to feel the pain he'd inflicted. And more than anything, He wanted to make sure Clint never cheated anyone else again. What Graham didn't realize was how far he was willing to go to make that happen. In the days that followed, Graham's behavior became more erratic. He started skipping work, spending his time tailing Clint instead. He watched him come and go from his modest apartment, trailed him to poker games in the seedy parts of town, and even followed him on a drive out to the secluded motel where he and Leona had been meeting. Graham noted every detail: what time Clint arrived, who he met with, and how long he stayed. He even snapped pictures on his phone, documenting Clint's movements like he was gathering evidence for a trial. In a way, it was therapeutic. The more Graham learned about Clint, the more he felt like he was reclaiming some of the control he had lost. But Graham's obsession began to take its toll. He barely ate or slept, consumed by the need to confront Clint. His friends noticed the change, though he avoided their questions. Even Leona, despite their strained relationship, seemed concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked one night as they sat in tense silence at the dinner table. Graham didn't look up from his plate. "Fine," he muttered. Leona hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, but in the end, she said nothing. The tipping point came on a Friday evening. Graham had followed Clint to a poker game at a rundown warehouse on the edge of town. He watched from his truck as Clint laughed and joked with the other players, his confidence infuriatingly intact. When Clint finally left, Graham followed him to a nearby diner. Clint sat at the counter, ordering coffee and pie like he didn't have a care in the world. Graham parked outside, watching him through the window. His anger boiled over. He couldn't take it anymore. Graham stormed into the diner, his boots echoing against the linoleum floor. Clint looked up, startled, as Graham approached. "Graham?" Clint said, his voice laced with nervousness. Graham didn't answer. He stood there, fists clenched, breathing hard. The diner fell silent as the other patrons watched the confrontation unfold. "We need to talk," Graham said finally, his voice low and steady. Clint's expression faltered, but he nodded. "Okay," he said, sliding off the stool. "Let's talk." They walked outside, the cold night air biting against their skin. Graham led Clint to the side of the building, away from prying eyes. "What do you want, man?" Clint asked, his usual bravado noticeably absent. "I want the truth," Graham said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "How long has it been going on?" Clint hesitated, his eyes darting to the ground. "Graham, don't lie to me," Graham snapped, cutting him off. "I know everything. I've seen the messages. I've followed you. So just tell me the truth." Clint sighed, running a hand through his hair. "A few months," he admitted. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to." "You didn't mean for it to?" Graham repeated, his voice rising. "You didn't mean to cheat with my wife? You didn't mean to betray me?" Clint flinched at the word, but he didn't respond. Graham took a step closer, his hands balled into fists. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" he said, his voice shaking. "You've destroyed my life. You've destroyed everything I thought I knew." "I'm sorry," Clint said quietly, but the words felt hollow. "Sorry doesn't fix this," Graham spat. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. Then, without warning, Graham lunged forward, grabbing Clint by the collar. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, shaking him. Clint didn't fight back. He stood there, his hands raised in surrender, as Graham vented his fury. "Was it worth it?" Graham demanded. "Was she worth it?" Clint didn't answer. Graham shoved him away, his chest heaving. He felt the weight of his anger, his heartbreak, his humiliation, all crashing down on him at once. He wanted to hurt Clint, to make him feel the same pain he'd been carrying. But in the end, he walked away. As Graham drove home that night, his mind raced. He had confronted Clint, but it hadn't given him the closure he needed. The anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for an outlet. And Graham knew that sooner or later, it would find one. Graham Daley had always considered himself a patient man. But after confronting Clint and hearing his hollow excuses, something inside him shifted. He'd stormed out of the diner that night, leaving Clint visibly shaken, but it wasn't enough. The rage, humiliation, and heartbreak still churned in his chest, like a fire that refused to die. He hadn't just lost his wife to another man. He'd been made a fool of by someone he trusted. The confrontation had brought Graham no relief. If anything, it only deepened his anger. Clint's stammered apology had sounded rehearsed, and his refusal to fight back only enraged Graham further. Clint had looked pathetic, weak, a coward hiding behind charm and excuses. Graham wanted to lash out, but he knew it wouldn't fix anything. That night, he drove aimlessly through Chattanooga, the glow of streetlights casting fleeting shadows across his face. The same thought kept racing through his mind. What now? Confronting Clint hadn't given him the peace he craved, and Leona still hadn't shown any real remorse. She continued to avoid him, spending more time at her volunteer work or locked away in her office. A few days later, Leona came home late again, slipping inside quietly like she hoped he wouldn't notice. Graham sat in the dark living room, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as he watched her. "Another meeting?" he asked, his voice calm but cold. Leona froze, her keys still in her hand. "Yeah," she replied after a pause, not bothering to elaborate. Graham stood slowly, the chair creaking under his weight. "You think I'm stupid, don't you?" "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning confusion. "I know you weren't at a meeting," Graham said, his voice rising. "I know you've been sneaking around with Clint." Leona's face paled, and she dropped her keys on the table. "Graham, I told you I'm sorry," she said, her tone defensive. "We've been over this." "No, we haven't," Graham snapped. "You think you can just say sorry, and everything will go back to normal? Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us?" Leona crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I can't change what happened," she said. "Maybe if you hadn't been so predictable, so boring, things would have been different." The words hit Graham like a punch to the gut. Predictable? Boring? He had worked himself to the bone to provide for their life together, to make her happy, and this was how she repaid him? "Get out," he said through clenched teeth. "What?" "I said, get out," Graham shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Leona stared at him for a long moment before grabbing her keys and walking out the door. The sound of her car starting and driving away left an eerie silence in its wake. For the next few days, Graham stewed in his anger. He replayed their argument over and over, each time growing angrier at both Leona and himself. He felt weak for letting her walk all over him, for not putting an end to it sooner. And he felt humiliated, knowing Clint was probably laughing about the whole thing. On the day of their anniversary, Graham decided to make one last attempt to save their marriage, or at least confront Leona with the truth she refused to face. He made reservations at a popular Chattanooga restaurant, hoping a public setting would keep their emotions in check. Leona agreed to meet him, arriving late and looking distracted. She barely glanced at him as she sat down, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape. "Thanks for coming," Graham said, trying to keep his voice steady. Leona shrugged. "What do you want, Graham?" "I want to know why," he said, his voice trembling. "Why Clint? Why would you throw everything away for him?" Leona sighed, looking down at her menu. "I don't know," she admitted. "It just happened." "That's not good enough," Graham said, his voice rising. Leona glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the attention they were drawing. "Can we not do this here?" she whispered. "No," Graham said firmly. "We are going to talk about this." But before he could say more, Leona's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up, her expression softening as she read the message. "Is that him?" Graham asked, his anger boiling over. Leona didn't answer. She stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. "I have to go," she said. "Leona, sit down," Graham said through gritted teeth. "I can't," she replied, walking away without a second glance. Graham sat there, stunned. His anniversary, their marriage, his entire life, it all felt meaningless. As he left the restaurant, Graham spotted Leona walking toward a nearby cafe. He followed her at a distance, his heart pounding as he watched her meet Clint at one of the outdoor tables. They laughed, their heads close together, as if Graham didn't exist. He clenched his fists, his vision narrowing as rage consumed him. He turned and walked away, knowing if he stayed any longer, he might do something he couldn't take back. That night, Graham sat alone in their empty house, the memories of his life with Leona playing like a cruel movie in his mind. He thought about the love they once shared, the promises they made, and how easily she had thrown it all away. By the time the sun rose, Graham had made a decision. He wasn't going to let Clint and Leona destroy him. He was going to take control, no matter the cost. The next day, Graham went to a sporting goods store and purchased some supplies. He told himself it was for protection, but deep down, he knew it was about regaining a sense of control. He spent hours focusing on precision and discipline, the repetitive actions giving him a strange sense of calm. That evening, Graham parked outside Clint's apartment, waiting for him to come home. He watched as Clint got out of his car, whistling a tune as he walked toward the building. Graham's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. But he didn't get out. Not yet. Instead, Graham went home and waited. He waited for the right moment, for the anger inside him to reach its boiling point. He told himself he wasn't a bad man, that he wasn't capable of doing something reckless. But as the days went on, that voice grew quieter, drowned out by the emotions. On the night of the confrontation, Graham felt eerily calm. He prepared himself with quiet determination before heading out. This time, he wasn't going to back down. When he arrived at Clint's apartment, Graham waited in the parking lot, his hands steady as he rehearsed what he was going to say. Clint needed to understand what he had done, to feel the weight of his actions. When Clint finally came outside, Graham stepped out of his truck and called his name. Clint turned, his expression shifting from confusion to fear as he saw the look in Graham's eyes. "Graham, man, what are you doing here?" Clint asked nervously. "We need to talk," Graham said, his voice firm. Clint raised his hands, taking a cautious step back. "Look, if this is about Leona—" "This is about respect," Graham interrupted, his tone sharp and unwavering. Clint's eyes widened as he realized the seriousness in Graham's voice. "Whoa, let's just talk, okay?" Clint said, his voice shaking. "Talk?" Graham said, his voice rising. "You want to talk after everything you've done? After you betrayed me and laughed in my face?" "I'm sorry, okay?" Clint said, his hands trembling. "I made a mistake." "Mistake?" Graham repeated, his voice laced with venom. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." The confrontation escalated, the tension between them thick as Graham stepped closer, his energy charged with raw emotion. In that moment, Graham felt a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. He realized that no amount of anger or confrontation could undo the damage that had been done. No matter what he said or did to Clint, it wouldn't bring back the life he'd lost. With a heavy sigh, Graham stepped back, his emotions giving way to exhaustion. Clint stared at him, his face pale and uncertain, as Graham turned and walked away without another word. As Graham drove home, he realized that he had reached the breaking point, and now there was no turning back. The house had become a tomb. The stillness that hung in the air was suffocating, pressing on Graham like a weight he could no longer bear. For weeks, he had tried to push down the feelings of betrayal, humiliation, and anger, but they refused to stay buried. Leona had all but moved out emotionally, if not physically. When she was home, she was distant, retreating to her office or staring at her phone, offering Graham little more than hollow words and cold glances. That evening, as Graham sat in the dimly lit living room, the noise of Leona moving around in the kitchen grated on him. Her indifference was unbearable. Her ability to continue on as though nothing had happened drove him to the brink. He tightened his grip on the armrest of his chair, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't let this go on. The silence, the lies, the anger, it was eating him alive. Before he could think twice, Graham stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor with a loud screech. His pulse pounded in his ears as he strode toward the kitchen, his footsteps heavy with determination. "Leona," he called, his voice sharp and deliberate. She turned from the sink, startled for a moment before her expression shifted to irritation. She tossed the dish towel onto the counter and crossed her arms. "What is it now, Graham?" she asked flatly, her tone cold and dismissive. "What is it now?" he repeated, incredulous. "That's all you have to say? You've been tearing our life apart for months, and you still act like it's nothing." Leona sighed, leaning against the counter. "We've been through this already," she said, waving a hand as if brushing him off. "I told you. I'm sorry. What more do you want from me?" "I want the truth," Graham snapped, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. "I want to know why you did it. Why, Clint? Why would you destroy everything we built for him?" Leona rolled her eyes, the gesture cutting Graham deeper than any words could. "It's not that simple, Graham," she said, her voice growing colder. "Maybe if you weren't so predictable, so suffocating, I wouldn't have needed to find something else, someone else." Graham's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Suffocating? Predictable?" he said, his voice rising. "I gave you everything, Leona. I worked every day to give us a good life, to make you happy, and this is how you repay me." "Repay you?" Leona shot back, her eyes flashing with anger. "You think you're some perfect husband? Newsflash, Graham, you're not. You made me feel trapped, like I was living in a cage. Clint made me feel alive again, something you never could." Her words felt like a knife twisting in his chest. The room seemed to shrink around him as his anger bubbled over, threatening to boil out of control. "You don't get to blame me for this," he growled. "You're the one who cheated. You're the one who destroyed everything." "Destroyed what, Graham?" Leona snapped, throwing her hands in the air. "This marriage was already dead. I just stopped pretending it wasn't." Her voice echoed in his ears, her words cutting deeper than any betrayal ever could. Graham felt the heat rising in his chest, his vision blurring with anger and heartbreak. Leona turned to leave, shaking her head. "I can't do this with you anymore," she said, her voice laced with exhaustion. "Don't you walk away from me," Graham said through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. Leona didn't respond. Without thinking, Graham reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not forceful. "Don't you dare walk away," he said, his voice low and strained. Leona wrenched her arm free, turning to face him with a fire in her eyes. "Let me go, Graham," she shouted. "You don't get to control me anymore." The argument escalated, their voices overlapping as they hurled years of pent-up frustration and resentment at each other. The tension in the room was thick, every word a spark threatening to ignite the fire between them. Graham's anger boiled over, his emotions surging past the point of control. His movements were a blur, driven by pure instinct rather than thought, as the haze of raw emotion consumed him. Suddenly Leona was on the floor, and everything went quiet. The stillness in the room was overwhelming, as if the air itself had stopped moving. Graham froze, his hands trembling as he took in the scene. His chest heaved, his mind racing to comprehend what had just happened, the weight of it settling on him like a physical force. "Leona," he called out softly, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. "Come on, say something." The stillness in the room was unbearable. She remained unresponsive, and a chilling realization began to settle over him. For a long moment, Graham stood rooted to the spot, his thoughts a chaotic storm. His knees buckled, and he dropped to the floor beside her, his hands hovering over her as if afraid to touch her. The reality of what he had done hit him like a tidal wave, and his stomach churned. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice cracking as tears welled in his eyes. He thought about calling the police, about telling them it had been an accident, but the image of handcuffs and a prison cell froze him in place. He couldn't go to jail. He wouldn't. The survival instinct kicked in, and Graham forced himself to move. He staggered to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He needed to make this look like something else, anything else. In a haze of panic, he began to stage the scene. He grabbed a pair of gloves from under the sink and slipped them on, his hands shaking as he worked. He overturned chairs and pulled open drawers, scattering their contents across the floor. He knocked over a lamp, sending it crashing to the ground, and tore a few cushions from the couch, slashing them with a knife. He glanced at Leona's phone, which lay a few feet away, and placed it near her hand to make it look like she had tried to call for help. When he was done, the house looked like it had been ransacked by an intruder. But as he stood in the middle of the chaos, his heart pounding, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Graham stared at the scene before him, his hands trembling as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The kitchen felt unbearably silent, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. His chest tightened, his breath shallow and uneven. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen as he debated his next move. Dialing the police felt like stepping into the point of no return, and his mind raced with the possibilities of what would happen next. Could he explain this? Would they even believe him? Before he could decide, a sharp knock came at the door. Graham's heart leapt into his throat. "Mr. Daley," called a familiar voice from the other side. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, who often stopped by unannounced. "I heard shouting. Everything okay in there?" Graham froze, unable to respond, the weight of the moment pinning him in place. The knocking continued, more insistent this time. "Hello?" she called again. When Graham still didn't answer, Mrs. Carmichael pulled out her phone. Within moments, she was speaking to someone, her voice rising with urgency. "There's something wrong at the Daley's house. I heard yelling, and now it's quiet. Please send someone." The sound of her voice jolted Graham back to reality. He looked down at Leona, his mind racing. It was too late now. The police were on their way. He sat on the couch, his hands trembling as he stared at the wreckage he had created. The stains on the floor had started to congeal, the metallic smell filling the air. His clothes were damp with sweat, and his heart pounded in his chest like a drum. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, their wail growing louder as they drew closer. Graham stood and wiped his face with shaking hands, steeling himself for what was to come. When the police arrived, their flashing lights illuminated the quiet street. Graham opened the door, his face pale and drawn, as the officers stepped inside. He repeated his story, his voice cracking as he described the break-in and how he had found Leona when he came home. The officers listened carefully, their expressions unreadable as they began to survey the scene. Graham tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a vice. He thought he had done enough to sell the story, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth would come out. The days after Leona's death were a blur for Graham. His attempts to stage the burglary had been hasty, and as the police combed through the house, their questions became more pointed. Graham knew his story wasn't airtight, but he clung to it, repeating it with rehearsed precision whenever asked. But the grief that had initially clouded his mind was now replaced by something darker. It wasn't regret over what had happened to Leona. That felt like a distant, surreal memory. No, what consumed him now was Clint. Clint, the man who had ruined everything. Clint, who had laughed behind his back, shared stolen moments with his wife, and helped dismantle the life Graham had worked so hard to build. Every time Graham closed his eyes, he saw Clint's face, smug and unrepentant. It wasn't enough that Leona was gone. Clint still existed, still walked the same streets, still lived without consequence. Graham couldn't let that stand. One evening, after pacing his living room for hours, Graham made his decision. He picked up his phone and dialed Clint's number. "Graham?" Clint answered cautiously after several rings. "We need to talk," Graham said, his voice cold. "I don't think that's a good idea," Clint replied. "Too bad," Graham snapped. "You owe me, Clint. Meet me at the old Miller warehouse. 10 o'clock. Before Clint could respond, Graham hung up. The Miller warehouse sat in Chattanooga's industrial district, a relic of a bygone era when manufacturing had dominated the city. It was quiet now, its rusted exterior and broken windows standing as a testament to its abandonment. Graham arrived early, parking his truck a short distance away and waiting in the shadows. The air was heavy with humidity, the faint hum of insects the only sound as Graham clenched and unclenched his fists, his mind swirling with rage. He didn't know what he was going to say or do, but he knew he needed to confront Clint face to face. When Clint's car finally pulled up, Graham stepped out from the shadows, his face grim. Clint hesitated before climbing out of the car, his movements cautious. "What do you want, Graham?" Clint asked, his voice wary. I want answers, Graham said, his voice low. I want to know how you could betray me like that. Clint sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Don't you dare, Graham interrupted, his voice rising. Don't you dare act like this was some accident. You knew what you were doing. You knew, and you didn't care. I'm sorry, okay? Clint said, his voice defensive. I messed up, but Leona, she wasn't happy, Graham. You have to understand that. Understand? Graham repeated, incredulous. You want me to understand why you slept with my wife? Why you destroyed my marriage? Clint took a step back, his hands raised. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Graham didn't let Clint finish. The rage that had been simmering inside him finally boiled over, and he surged forward, his emotions exploding in a single, unrestrained moment. He shoved Clint back, his movements rough and impulsive. What is wrong with you? Clint shouted, stumbling but catching himself against the hood of the car. You ruined my life. Graham yelled, his voice breaking under the weight of his anger. You took everything from me. The confrontation grew heated, their voices echoing in the empty parking lot. Clint tried to reason with him, his words quick and defensive, but Graham wasn't listening. The emotional tension spiraled, each man pushing the other closer to the edge. In the chaos, Graham's actions turned reckless. All of a sudden Clint was on the ground. He didn't get back up. The sudden silence was deafening. Graham stood over him, his chest heaving as he realized what he had done. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breaths. For a moment, he thought Clint might get up, but as the seconds dragged on, it became clear that he wouldn't. Graham stumbled backward, his heart pounding. Panic set in as he glanced around the empty lot, his mind racing. He couldn't stay here. He had to go. He climbed into his truck, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. As he drove away, the enormity of what he had done began to sink in. First Leona, now Clint. Graham had thought confronting Clint would bring him peace, but instead, it ignited a storm he couldn't escape. The investigation into Leona's death had already raised questions. The staged burglary wasn't holding up under scrutiny, and the police were beginning to focus their attention on Graham. Detective Marcus Reed, with years of experience under his belt, had a knack for noticing the little things that didn't add up. The ransacked house felt too staged, too calculated. There were no signs of forced entry, and Graham's alibi, the vague claim that he had been running errands, lacked credibility. Then there were the messages. Leona's phone had been recovered at the scene, and it painted a damning picture of her relationship with Clint. The texts revealed the affair in stark detail, but they also revealed something else. Graham's growing frustration in the weeks leading up to her death. I'm not going to let you ruin my life. One message from Graham read. You'll regret what you've done. When Detective Reed confronted Graham with the messages, his defense wavered. He stammered, trying to explain them away as words said in anger, but Reed wasn't convinced. But the turning point came when Clint's disappearance was reported. Clint's co-workers had noticed his absence, and his abandoned car was found near the Miller warehouse. When his body was discovered days later, the police connected the dots. Graham's connection to both Leona and Clint made him the prime suspect, and it wasn't long before detectives arrived at his doorstep with a warrant. In the interrogation room, Graham sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and drawn. Detective Reed sat across from him, a stack of evidence files on the table between them. You've been lying to us from the start, Reed said, his voice calm but firm. We know you did it with Leona, and we know you did it with Clint. It's over, Graham. Graham stared at the table, his hands trembling in his lap. The weight of everything he had done pressed down on him, crushing any resistance he might have had. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he said quietly, his voice barely audible. But it did, Reed said. And now you need to tell the truth. Graham took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging. For the first time in weeks, he let go of the lies he had been clinging to. He confessed to everything. The argument with Leona, the staged burglary, the confrontation with Clint. In court, Graham's confession was damning. His defense attorney painted him as a broken man, driven to madness by betrayal and heartbreak. But the jury wasn't swayed. The prosecution argued that Graham's actions were deliberate and calculated, fueled by jealousy and a desire for control. The verdict was swift, guilty on all counts. Graham was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he sat in his cell, the enormity of his actions finally sank in. He had lost everything: his wife, his freedom, and the life he had worked so hard to build. The anger that had once consumed him had burned out, leaving only a hollow emptiness in its place. And in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, Graham couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it.